Program, B.S. English. Course, Literary Criticism. Topic, Coleridge's Critique of Wordsworth's Poetic Theory. Prepared by, Dr. Shahryar Khan. Question. What are the objections raised by Coleridge on Wordsworth's poetic theory? What are his views on rustic themes, language, and meter of poetry? Discuss. Introduction. In his preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth made three important statements. Firstly, he said that he chose low and rustic life, because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil. Secondly, the language of the rustics is adopted because such men hourly communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived. Thirdly, between the language of prose and that of metrical composition, there neither is, nor can be, any essential difference. Coleridge went on to criticize these assertions in Biographia Literaria. Critics like Welleck and I.A. Richards think that Coleridge's stance is rational and well-grounded, while Hazlitt and some others think that Coleridge betrayed the very ideal of Romantic movement. Despite this controversy, Coleridge's views on poetic language and themes are considered a significant development in the history of literary criticism. With his usual philosophical rigor, Coleridge has highlighted weaknesses in the poetic theory of Wordsworth. Point 1. Coleridge criticizes Wordsworth's choice of rustic characters and life by saying that not all of his characters are chosen from rustic life. For example, characters in poems like Ruth, Michael, the brothers, are not rustic. Secondly, they speak in a common language which is not linked with their occupation or abode. The language is so general that it would not have made any difference if these characters had belonged to a different place or occupation. Coleridge says that any individual who lives an independent life and who has a basic religious education does speak in this manner. This has nothing to do with their close connection with nature. Even if these characters lived in the city, they would have similar sentiments and language. Coleridge asserts that a man can only be benefited from rural life if he has natural sensibility and basic education. In the absence of these two, his mind would harden in rural conditions. He would become selfish and hard-hearted. Therefore, Wordsworth's argument about rustic life and themes is not valid. Point 2. Secondly, Coleridge objects to Wordsworth's view that the best part of language is derived from the objects with which the rustics hourly communicate. He says that the communication with objects implies reflection on them, and richness of vocabulary arises out of this reflection. The rural life does not require such reflection. Hence, the rustics do not have rich vocabulary. They can only express simple facts and not complex ideas and thoughts. Moreover, one's language is not improved through communication with nature but through education. The rustics who are capable of using richer vocabulary have not learned it through their communication with nature. They learned it from preachers and the Bible. This implies that they do have some basic education. In the absence of such an education, they could not have used such vocabulary. Hence, it proves the point that just communion with nature is not enough. Point 3. Thirdly, Wordsworth asserts that the language of poetry is the real language of men. Coleridge says that every man's language varies according to his knowledge and sensibilities. This means that one's individuality and social class play their role in shaping one's vocabulary. Even men belonging to the same class do not use the same kind of language. Hence, rustics do not speak the same language. Their language cannot be considered universal and general language of poetry. In order to make such a language universal, the poet has to purge it of its specific features like family, social class, locality, etc. After the removal of such peculiarities, this language would no more be the language of rustics or of any class. It would become general. It would no more be the real language of men in the sense in which Wordsworth meant it to be. Point 4. Wordsworth's contention that there is no essential difference between the language of poetry and that of prose is also criticized by Coleridge. He says that there is and there ought to be an essential difference between the language of prose and that of poetry. Language is both a matter of words and the arrangement of these words. In both prose and poetry, words are the same but their arrangement is different. This difference is because of the meter. Poetry uses meter and meter requires a different arrangement of words. Coleridge rejects Wordsworth's claim that meter is superficial. He thinks that meter is an essential part of poetic composition. On this ground, the language of prose and poetry are not the same as they are arranged differently. Moreover, the purpose of prose and poetry is not the same. For example, the purpose of a poem is to provide pleasure while the purpose of scientific prose is to provide truth. Meter contributes in the pleasure of a poem. Therefore, the language of prose and poetry is not the same. Conclusion. To conclude, we can say that Coleridge's critique of Wordsworth's poetic theory is significant in the history of literary criticism. He pointed out the logical weaknesses in Wordsworth's claims. Coleridge highlighted how Wordsworth's own practice contradicts his theory. Some critics are of the view that Coleridge's critique is more in line with neoclassical theory of poetry and he is conservative in his approach. However, this must be kept in view that Coleridge is not advocating a specialized vocabulary for poetry. His argument is that the language of any one class cannot be the language of poetry as it is not universal. If Wordsworth rejects urban elitist language, how can he advocate the language of rustics? The language of rustic is also specific. If one purges it of its peculiarities, it would just become common language spoken by all and then it would no more be the language of rustics. Hence, Coleridge is just pointing to contradictions in Wordsworth's theory. He is not going against romantic ideals.